Hello and welcome to another episode of the Silk and Steel podcast. I am your host, Carl Za. I had done a tech war series about 3 years ago, during the last day of Trump presidency with my friend Mr. T. Back then, the tech war was just getting shaped up. But throughout the Biden presidency, the tech war with China has intensified. And so I'm very excited to welcome Mr. TP Huang to my podcast to talk about this. I first got to know TP on Twitter, and I very soon realized he's extremely knowledgeable in the China tech space. But maybe I should let TP introduce himself. So, welcome to the show, TP.
Hi, Carl. Good to talk to you. Just to give a little background on myself, I've been someone that actually started off by following military tech back 20 years ago when I came out of college, and slowly over time, this has from my focus has moved from military to more of a civilian stuff. And in the past few years, I've been very concentrated on just trying to understand as much on EVs, semiconductors, AI, and quantum computing, and everything. Like, there's so much details, so much geopolitical implications to the various tech issues that we're dealing with here. So I've been spending a lot of time on this and talking to a lot of people who are um, more connected with the semiconductor industry than I am, and I think I've been spending pretty much the last couple of years just been tweeting and uh, trying to get as much information out there as possible.
We appreciate that. And maybe we first can start to talk about the latest Huawei breakthrough and what it means for the US semiconductor ban on China. Because as far as I understand, the whole US put on this very stringent semiconductor control export on China because US wants to prevent China from making advanced semiconductors the way that the Taiwan semiconductor company TSMC makes them. And this has led to essentially killed off Huawei's 5G phone business for a couple of years. I'm in Indonesia, in Bali. When I landed in 2019, I remember seeing Huawei in phone stores everywhere. But uh, around 2020, I started seeing only Xiaomi, Oppo, and other Chinese brand, and no longer Huawei phone available. So this latest Huawei release of their flagship phone, Huawei Mate Pro 60, it's a big deal. Yes.
Oh yeah, this is like a seismic move. I think that Huawei itself was on the receiving end of this complete entity list treatment several years back. So um, although SMIC, or as I call them, SMIC, also received you know export controls during this time, but it was only starting from October that the export control got really stringent across the entire Chinese semiconductor industry.
So we have to break it down for our listeners. We have to get into some really basic terminology here. So SMIC is a semiconductor manufacturer company in China, on mainland China. They had hired, I think it was originally started by some engineers who previously worked at TSMC, no?
Right, I think so too.
TSMC, they're the ones who actually manufacture the semiconductor chip. So Huawei may design the chip, and in the past, they would pass the design to Taiwan Semiconductors to actually make their design into wafers. But the what the U.S. sanction did was telling companies like Taiwan and South Korea, no, you cannot manufacturing chips for Huawei anymore. At the same time, they also place the Chinese semiconductor producers SMIC on the entity list, which means any companies that use U.S. technology, any part of U.S. technologies, they will be restricted from doing business with SMIC. So it's a very stringent export control regime that's designed to cripple China's semiconductor industry, and not just China's semiconductor, but I think it's designed to cripple the China's tech space because everything is dependent on the semiconductors. Back to you. Sorry.
The Biden administration would say this is for a military purpose. We're trying to do this for national security um, implications. But the reality is, this is very much of an attack, I would say, against the entire Chinese tech industry. And in general, in some way, I would say unflatteringly, this was designed to make China poor, basically, by rolling back on the China's movement in this advanced spaces like AI, EVs, robotics, and things like that. And you see that many of these things uh, being affecting Chinese industries as a whole. Because if you don't have the advanced semiconductors, you don't have the ability to run some of the advanced AI models that you want to run. And then if you don't have enough advanced semiconductors, you can't have ADAS, what we call basically assisted driving on your EVs. So these are really amazing technologies being developed by Chinese companies right now. In some cases, they're still dependent on Western techs.
Yeah.
In other cases, Chinese companies like Huawei itself is developing chips that are getting made by SMIC and actually able to perform just as well. But as a whole, I think this entire October experience taught the Chinese industry whatever you need to buy from abroad, you need to find local sources because whether it's semiconductors or airplanes or robotics, anything could be banned. Like the implication is anything could be banned.
Yeah, I think what the logic of Biden administration is that they thought they found the weakest link in the Chinese tech street because there's still an overwhelming dominance of the U.S. companies and U.S. Patents in the semiconductor industry, and they thought by choking off the semiconductor industry, you will cripple Chinese tech development for generations. There's actually an excellent article in New York Times titled "Act of War." So essentially, United States is waging economic war against China, and the aim is to keep China back for generations. It was actually cited in the article by one of the person that was deeply involved in the think tank, Washington think tank, that came out with a strategy. And apparently the former Google CEO Eric Schmidt was behind this push because, well, he himself has very fat contract with the Pentagon to supposedly revolutionize future U.S. warfare by utilizing AI. And his idea is that we can't let China develop Skynet before we do. So we must cripple China's AI industry, and to do that, we got to cripple their semiconductor capability. And they use the fact that the semiconductor global supply chain is actually incredibly diversified. There are companies in the US, companies in Japan, in South Korea, Taiwan, Netherlands, all involved in design, manufacturing, both the software and the hardware. And so the idea that they thought is it will be impossible for China to replicate this whole ecosystem. They literally were quoted on saying, if China to try to replicate this, it would be very hard. It would be like to rebuild a human civilization from scratch. And one thing that Huawei is able to do that caught a lot of people in surprise is they were able to design a chip and rely on domestic Chinese semiconductor producer SMIC to produce some say 7 nanometer, some say 5 nanometer chip that actually gave pretty good performances. That wasn't supposed to happen. China wasn't supposed to possess anything that produce a chip that's below like 28 nanometer realm. And just to break it down even further for our audience, the number of nanometer is supposed to be the spacing between transistors. And traditionally before, it's when above 28 nanometers, that's the actual spacing between the transistors. But after 28 nanometers, there's a new different technology, the FinFET technology, that actually changed the geometry a little bit. So now when they're talking about 7 nanometer and 5 nanometer or even 3 nanometer, it's really more, I heard it's more a marketing term. um, what I actually didn't understand then, what does it mean when they say they have 7 nanometer versus, say, TSMC just made the 3 nanometer chip for iPhone 15? It's not it can't be completely marketing driven, right? TP.
Yeah, so I think the important part to note is that TSMC, Samsung, and SMIC itself are always trying to improve on their semiconductor manufacturing by what they call shrinking. Just basically, the idea is you fit more transistors into a smaller space. By doing that, your processors, you can have more transistor. It's in there, and run your processes. And the smaller, the higher the density normally, assuming similar design, normally the higher the density, you get lower power consumption. So, which is why when it comes to stuff like smartphones, it's a big deal because it's very much dependent on, it's very space constrained. You can only have so much space for your chips in a smartphone. And also you really care about power consumption, because if you use too much power, then your battery drains really quickly. So what Huawei did here with SMIC that's really special was they didn't really have the latest. They didn't have a 3 nanometer process. They had this, I would say, a 7 nanometer process that's continuously improved, but it's still 7 nanometers. And they were able to design a chip that, while the power consumption wasn't as good as your 4 or 5 nanometer process, but at lower usage, it works pretty well. They had really great heat dissipation technology to it. So even if the chip itself generates a little more heat, your phone doesn't feel like it's hotter. Uh, they had really nice battery pack, have really high charging speeds. So most users, when they use it, they don't notice, you know, the chip processor itself is draining the battery, because as far as end users are concerned, they only care about how much time they can watch their movies and use their phones throughout the course of the day. So I haven't heard anyone complain about their phone not lasting long enough for Mate 60. So it's actually worked out. And the people that thought they were going to just be able to stop Huawei from designing competitive phones has clearly failed in this, because you don't actually need 3 nanometer process to have a really good phone in this case.
Yeah, that's one thing that to be know. Most consumers, they don't care whether the phone is made with 3 nanometers or 5 nanometers or 7 nanometer. They expect you have a great camera, you have great battery life, right? And it's maybe the performance when you do graphics, you renders it correctly. That's what people care about. Which make it incredibly odd that U.S. government is putting all this effort just trying to kill off Huawei's phone business, because all their claim about this advanced semiconductor is going to aid China's uh, building nuclear weapons and missiles is preposterous, because you don't need 7 nanometer chips to go in a ballistic missile. In fact, you actually want more robust semiconductors in something like that will carry a nuclear warhead, because you want it to be hardened against radiation. So and the requirement for the small size of transistor only makes sense if you're using a phone, because on a phone, a customer handheld phone, you want the chip to be as small as possible. But whereas you don't have the size constraint on an intercontinental ballistic missile, and
Right.
so all the
So
U.S. claim about military application, or the current military application, is preposterous. What they're really talking about is they're talking about AI. The future, the Eric Schmidt is selling this idea that the generative AI is going to be the force industrial revolution, and this is a revolution that U.S. must win. Against China, because if China advances to beyond US in AI, then some US will lose its hegemony basically, and that's unacceptable for the elite in Washington. And apparently, he convinced everybody, all the decision makers in Washington, that it's imperative that United States cripple China's AI effort. But what I heard is that it's true that AI currently, like the GPT, require a lot of advanced chips like NVIDIA chips to run. But what I also heard is that there are other ways around that. Like do you know anything about that, or can you speak to that?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things I want to just address
Yeah.
here. Firstly, a lot of people don't realize that when they're talking about supercomputer centers and things like that, you don't need even 7 nanometer chips. China has been building these mega supercomputers, exaflop supercomputers with 14 nanometer chips data centers. Obviously, they'll end up probably using more electricity and generates more power. But when it comes to major industrial or national defense applications, they don't really care about that as much as long as they have this power that can run the processes. Uh, so that was a misguided policy to begin with. And then we can talk about the AI itself. AI itself is kind of interesting because what the Washington elites and probably Eric Schmidt did not realize is Huawei has its own AI chip that it's starting 2019 and it was on 7 nanometers and it's called Ascend 910. And during the preceding few years, it actually was having some issues. It can only stock up so much from pre-sanction days, and then when October sanctions hit, now SMIC is more incentivized than ever to work with Huawei. So you started seeing from earlier this year that Huawei really started producing what I call HPC. It's like high performance compute, high power, high performance computing chips, and we're talking about large server chips and also AI chips. And based on Huawei's own slide, its AI clusters, which links up a bunch of its AI chips together in one network. And Huawei is really great with linking things together and doing things like that. Has higher computation power than these A100 clusters and even H100 clusters. And it is actually able to replicate this all within its own technology stack and with its partners. And the major advantage that NVIDIA had over competitors all this time was actually not even the chip itself, but rather CUDA. Which is the AI language underneath it. So a lot of the AI frameworks like PyTorch was optimized to with CUDA to the best of my knowledge, and NVIDIA was the first game in town, so everyone basically got everything to work with NVIDIA, and they put up with the high cost because NVIDIA stuff worked pretty well, and that's what they had. But if you don't give that to Chinese tech companies, they're going to not just give up; they will use what's available to them. So in this case, in Huawei, it decided right from the start we're going to use our own chips, which is Ascend. We're going to use our own AI platform, which is Mindspore, and we're going to build the best, you know, AI clusters in China. We're going to put this on our cloud. We're going to help Chinese government and Chinese local government build various smart city projects. And all the major Chinese LLMs, the large language models, are going to be trained on Sen. So you'll see that when they do the reporting, um, over half of the LLMs in China are trained with Sen technology because Huawei solution is enough for most of the use cases.
That's another important point, because before the U.S. applied tech sanction against China, Chinese companies are happy to work with international companies. Huawei was happy to source its chip manufacturing to TSMC on Taiwan. It was happy to put, SMIC, the Chinese semiconductor equipment firm, was happy to buy product from the Dutch manufacturer ASML, and they also depended on a lot of the U.S. software and to make their product. And there was less incentive to go with unproven domestic producers and technology, because why spend more money on like a less efficient process when you can just have outsource your manufacturing to TSMC. But now the Chinese companies have no choice. Like Huawei they cannot go to TSMC to have their chips made. They have to go to SMIC. So now they are willing to pay more for something that previously this is one reason why people are asking. China has been spending billions of dollars into the chip design and research and manufacturing for years, since 1990s. It has why it hasn't yield a breakthrough results until now. And the reason is the Chinese chip manufacturing is always lag 2 generations behind, is because these Chinese companies, they can always go with the proven international companies that can deliver the capability with more efficiency, rather than go with domestic route, which may be like a couple generation behind in technology. But now they have no choice. All the Chinese companies are now in it together. It's do or die. And so it created the incentive for a lot of research and development dollars to be funneled into the Chinese domestic semiconductor manufacturing capability. So maybe like somebody, at the after this is all over, maybe the Chinese semiconductor industry need to we invite Biden over and award him like a tongue medal, like, because they have this sanction. In a way, you create a lot of short-term pain, but I think over long term, you actually created the right incentive in the Chinese semiconductor manufacturing, and we're seeing a lot of the progress is because of that. What do you say to that?
Yeah, so I think that's a very good point. Uh, I also want to just make it obvious to people that this is something that takes many years to actually roll out. A lot of times when you throw money at it, doesn't the results are not going to show up in the first 5 years. It's going to take 10, 15 years for all these basic engineering to show up. So that's kind of part of what's going on here. Sorry, apologize for that. And the other thing to keep in mind is that you're right that it's very important for the Chinese companies to be working with the local companies. So in the case of Huawei, by working with SMIC gets better at designing chips, producing chips for Huawei. And then by SMIC working with local Chinese semiconductor equipment manufacturers like Nora, AMEC. Uh, these companies actually now get a chance to enter the what we call the supply chain, but it's actually the equipment chain of SMIC and other major Chinese manufacturers. And over time, by working with these guys, their equipment can improve faster without working with SMIC, they will not get a real chance at improving their product because when they first start, maybe with using Nora's product, you only get 75% yield on your 28 nanometer process, and you can get it over 90% with Lam and AMAT. But over time, by working with domestic equipment manufacturers, this yield will go up to 90%. And most commercial companies will not give these guys this chance because you can't risk having 20% lower profit margins on your process. What are you going to say to your shareholders and things like that? But now that this is such a critical issue, everyone recognizes you have to work with these guys. You have no choice. So we're seeing this really quick progress from Chinese fabs in memory chips, in logic chips, And I think that's one of the major failings of the October sanctions, that the American government didn't really recognize at the time where the Chinese industry was, because they clearly had this ability in them to make this progress that
I
they didn't see it.
remember, I remember in October, there's a so-called China expert, Jordan Schneider, wrote this infamous tweet. He said, "This is it. This is a total annihilation of Chinese semiconductor industry. It's going to zero overnight." And he tweeted as Biden rolled out this sanction. And I'm gonna retweet that tweet whenever I get a chance because this is kind of the hubris behind the U.S. decision makers when they implemented this sanction. And also like to point it out, some people say, "Oh, but the nanometer process, the SMIC used to make Huawei's latest chip, that's still a couple generations behind. That's like 5 year, 7 year old technology." I like to point out this is actually the iPhone 15 that just came out, which uses 3 nanometer chip made by TSMC, is actually having a lot of problems because the TSMC is actually having trouble to perfect this 3 nanometer process. So the Apple actually have to downgrade a lot of their requirements in order just to get this phone rushed out in time. So now we're getting reports on the iPhone 15 have actually have a battery issue, have the overheating problem. It's because this imperfect 3 nanometer process, and it's actually incredibly difficult to make these chips for a handphone. What people don't realize is that Apple Huawei has successfully designed a 5G chipset for a domestic 5G chipset to replace a Qualcomm Snapdragon 5G Snapdragon chip that previously you relied on, but was cut off due to the U.S. sanction. And Apple tried to do the same for its iPhone 15, and they failed. There's a great article recently on how Apple failed to make 5G chip for its own phone in order to replace Qualcomm chips, because it's actually to make the modem for the phone is actually incredibly difficult. But that's a feat that Huawei had managed even before this year. They before they had managed to create their own 5G chipset, but they still depended on TSMC to make them. And I think this is my guess is this is the reason why Huawei was singled out by the U.S. sanctions because Huawei is basically the leader in China to indigenize a lot of these technology. What do you think? What do you say about that?
Yeah, so I think that I want to just start by saying that let's one mistake that certain Western analysts make is they see just the 7 nanometer chip. They say, "What's the big deal?" But what we are seeing here is more than just that chip itself. It's what this tells us about the entire Chinese semiconductor industry, and what the phone itself says about the Chinese semiconductor industry. Because it's there's so many chips that goes into a phone. Recently, just yesterday, I saw a photo where the case that Huawei is selling for their Mate 60 to cool the phone, even that has a chip in there.
Wow.
Astonishing, right? So everything uses chip, and what you can see with all the report is that aside from a couple memory chips, 90% of the chips in the phone are from local suppliers. So you went from this thing that's like multinational, all these OEMs like Xiaomi, Oppo are taking from different vendors and integrate them together into one phone, to a case where Huawei just cultivated the supply chain overnight, or not overnight. It's over like 3 or 4 years, but obviously they've been working with these guys, making sure that they reach the Huawei standard before this Mate 60 phone came out. And I don't know if you saw my Twitter photo, but I posted some pictures of the Mate 5X photos versus Apple 15 photos, and you can see the Mate 5X photos are just better. Like they capture the light better. There's no glare on them. and that's you know that's due to the chips themselves that they use for the lens, the optical modules, but also the software in the Huawei system, and also the NPUs in the Kirin 9000S. And even aside from that, as you said, the 5G modem was a huge deal. People don't realize how hard it is to make a 5G modem that's up to par with what Qualcomm is doing. And in my opinion, based on all the tests, it's better than Qualcomm one because people are joking about how bad the iPhone signals everywhere in China, whereas like 5X is achieving mind-blowing 5G speed in China. So when we're talking about this, the Mate 60 phone, everything they did from the 5G modem themselves to the what I call the RF module, which is basically the radio frequency module. Everything was a lot of these were using American chips before, and now they managed to develop their own stuff. So the a question is like, as these Chinese suppliers ramp up capacity, are the other Chinese OEMs like Xiaomi, Oppo, and Vivo, are they going to be using uh, local Chinese supply chain also? I would say they will. And what does that do to all the the American and Korean companies that have been selling these chips to China all this time? And that's the kind of the the can of worms you open when you decide to sanction China, because once China does develop this local supply chain, it's just not going to use you anymore.
Exactly. I would not buy Qualcomm stocks right now. I mean, if you look at the Qualcomm numbers, the vast majority of their product they send over to China, and these either go. I don't know if they count into the fact that Qualcomm chips is using iPhone. Maybe because iPhone production is happening in China, so maybe that goes in part of their statistic. But China market account to overwhelmingly. The Qualcomm numbers. And as you say, if the other Chinese phone manufacturer like Xiaomi, which I believe currently using Qualcomm chips, decide to switch to Huawei chips, then that's going to have catastrophic consequences for Qualcomm's bottom line. And this will happen not just for Qualcomm, but for memory makers, for a whole slew of the Western companies that had relied on the Chinese market for decades to basically to have a healthy profit margin. And US sanction basically wipe out that healthy profit margin. And the US government is asking these companies to take it for the sake of so-called US national security. But I wanted to switch track a little bit. I want to talk about possible still bottlenecks that present. So we talked about the 7 nanometer technology that Huawei uses in its current phone release. But but the way they use to manufacture the 7 nanometer process is they use an older technology. They use a DUV machines, also produced by a Netherlands company, ASML, that was not under the sanction list yet. So while SMIC was able to stockpile of these ASML machines, and then they use a process that was first pioneered by the TSMC, I think back in 2017, what they call multi-patterning to make 7 nanometer chip. It just more because it's more there's more processing. It's not as efficient as using ASML's latest lithography machine, the EUV machines. But the EUV machine export to China is still forbidden. So, uh, so China to go below the 7 nanometer process, they will have to, you know, have to come up with their own EUV lithography machine. What do you say to that?
So I think in terms of progress they're making on just advanced chip making, they can still improve density on there before they have to get to EUVs. The SMIC can still get better at their etching process, and they have access to some pretty advanced DUV lithography machines from ASML that they bought over time. And I think in the immediate future, they should be concerned about raising and increasing to as much of the 7 nanometer or 6 nanometer productions as they can. But longer term, obviously, you would want UV in your STEM. Now, some of this stuff, obviously, the uh, China's side of things, they want to hide their progress on this area as much as they can. So, I don't want to release too much of the information. I'll just say this: